Again, my name is Jessica Burdett with the Department of Commerce. I manage energy efficiency, assurance, and operations for the State Energy Office within the Division of Energy Resources. Today, our webinar is to kick off a project that has been about a year in the making and is going to two potential studies, a demand side and a supply side potential study. We'll start with providing a background on the study and the purpose of the study. Then I will pass along to my colleagues Carl Nelson and Mike Bull with Center for Energy and Environment to discuss the demand side study overview. And then after that, we will pass along to the lead on the supply side study, Travis Hinkle with GDS. And then after we go through these slides, we'll go through a question and answer session, and we'll look forward to having your questions typed in so we can look at those and answer as we go. So to start, this study is born out of a long-time program that we have established, the Conservation Improvement Program. We have been doing SIP in some form since the early 1980s when the Public Utilities Commission first directed a pilot to demonstrate the feasibility of investments in energy efficiency. And over time, the program has changed to include various spending requirements to bring in more utilities into the portfolio, including all investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, and rural electric cooperatives. In 2007, the Next Generation Energy Act was passed, which was a pretty big game change for the Conservation Improvement Program. While there was an established minimum spending requirement for utilities, there also was established a 1.5% annual energy savings goal that went into effect in 2010. This goal, there are a few different components. It is adjustable to 1% by the Commissioner based on a variety of criteria. And then there's also an allowance for utilities to claim savings from supply-side efficiency projects of up to 0.5% of their 1.5% energy savings goal. So this last year, 2017, is the 10-year anniversary of the Next Generation Energy Act. The last time, so as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of utilities that are required to meet the spending requirements as well as the energy savings goal. We have quite a broad portfolio of utilities in the fold. We have just over 180 utilities, 7 of which are investor-owned utilities, 44 distribution cooperatives, and 130 municipal utilities. And how SIP has worked is that it is not a centrally run program, but because each individual utility has an energy savings goal, they are enabled to develop their own programs to meet the needs and purpose of their service territory. And so as you can imagine, we have a wide variety of programs within SIP. I think last year there was a count of programs that have either been in practice or are currently being administered. There were about 2,000 that we have recorded in the energy savings platform. The performance since the Next Generation Energy Act was passed of utilities has been on a trajectory of, and particularly on the electric side and natural gas side, of increasing savings. as programs have developed and matured, we've seen a lot more savings since 2010. And consistently since the goal went into effect, utilities have been meeting the goal. We just completed our review of the 2015 performance and don't have that included yet, but I believe we did achieve statewide the 1.5% energy savings goal. Likewise with natural gas, because the goal is adjustable by the commissioner, natural gas utilities have a 1% goal, but the natural gas utilities have, for the most part, achieved their goals over time and continue to increase their performance as time goes on. Before I move on, just for some context, the last potential study that we did, a statewide potential study, was done in 2011, and part of the reasoning behind doing the study now is that we believe it's a good time for a check-in, that some of those results may be a little out of date and a lot has changed in the industry in terms of technology, and we think that this is a good time to start revisiting what the potential is, what the programs are, and what the policies may be moving forward. So we also have a Applied Research and Development Fund, many of you know as CARD, and the purpose of this work, the research and development, is to help utilities achieve the 1.5% savings goal by identifying new technologies or strategies, improving the effectiveness of programs, and as well as documenting CO2 reductions from these programs. We have amassed a portfolio of over 90 projects that have been funded since 2008. We have received during that time over 380 proposals for various research studies to support the goals. And we do that through a RFP process and a competitive process. We, this last cycle, decided that with this program it was appropriate to look at doing this potential study and that it aligned with those goals that I outlined earlier. We also think that, you know, with the results of a lot of these studies that have been delivered by various vendors in various sectors, as you can see, there's been, you know, significant emphasis on commercial, residential, up to a lesser extent industrial. We've tried to cover a number of sectors in looking at various technologies and programs to help utilities identify how they can achieve their goals. And what we think is that with these studies, they will help inform also the potential study in a more directed way. I think one of the challenges that we've had here at the department is helping utilities realize the results of those actual potential studies, and in addition to realizing it's a good time to revisit what the potential is for all of our utilities, how do we direct some of the results of those studies into a place that can help utilities realize the results and put into practice some of the findings. And so there's a couple of objectives, I think, being met by this work. So to go into a little bit more detail, we chose to do the demand side and supply side potential studies in tandem, recognizing that there is some continuity between looking at the value chain of the system from supply to end use, and that there are points of efficiency throughout the system, both on the supply and the demand side, and that looking at those in tandem could help us identify where there's points of optimization within the system and enable us to have a discussion around some of the gray area between supply and demand that includes behind the meter and in front of the meter activities such as load management, storage, demand response that can enable deployment of efficiency for not only the consumer but can also enable efficiency for the utility system. And so by having these conversations and these potential studies done in tandem, we think that we'll be able to find some pretty interesting results that give us a holistic perspective of the entire value chain of the energy system, limited to electric and natural gas utilities. We also, something to note with the supply side or electric utility infrastructure efficiency, we received a U.S. Department of Energy grant award to engage stakeholders to have a discussion about the policies associated with this work, the technologies available to utilities, to discuss the regulatory barriers or opportunities, and to have a discussion of how these efficiencies within the site of the system can manifest themselves towards utilities being able to claim those savings in SIP and to make changes throughout their system. So I will close in saying that this is a pretty large undertaking, and we really don't want to make decisions or execute this study in isolation or in a vacuum. And so we have really, in selecting the vendors to execute these studies, had an aversion to a cookie-cutter approach, that we didn't want something that would just be kind of the same iteration of potential studies that many of you have seen that sometimes land on a shelf and don't really address the nuances and dynamics of the policy framework and the challenges that utilities and customers have in implementing efficiency. And so we, in procuring the studies, really had an emphasis on wanting local representation, regional representation, and national representation to be able to give a 360 view of what's going on here at home, but also what's trends are occurring at the national level from that, and have that bird's eye view perspective. We also recognize that stakeholder input is going to be key to the success of this study. Without hearing from individual utilities, consumer advocacy, environmental advocacy, consumers, this won't be a study that will be able to be put into practice. The results won't be able to be put into practice in the way that we hope. And so what we found in selecting the vendors who we selected is, for the demand side potential study, Center in Energy and Environment assembled a remarkable team that includes Seventh Wave, ACEEE, Optimal Energy, that can cover many perspectives and that will be able to engage stakeholders in a meaningful way, so that there is direction and purpose and intent in the study, and that the results that we hope to have are meaningful to the broader stakeholder group. Likewise, with the supply side energy potential study, GDS, who was awarded the contract, has helped us develop supply side efficiency measures for inclusion in our technical reference manual. And as we're delving into a new area for a lot of folks in the energy industry around trying to model the potential, we believe that between GDS and CADMIS and CEE that we'll be able to develop some results that are not only to some extent on the leading edge, but also help utilities fulfill some of the enabling policy options around claiming supply-side efficiency within the Conservation Improvement Program goals. So with that, I will pass this along to Carl Nelson to introduce their work and give a more detailed perspective and the approach for the demand-side potential study.
All right, great. Thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. This is Carl Nelson from Center for Energy and Environment, and I'll be talking about the demand-side, customer-facing component of the energy optimization studies that Jessica had mentioned. And as Jessica talked about, just to give you a little bit of background on this study, the Minnesota SIP program has been enormously successful in both saving energy for Minnesota households and businesses, as well as dramatically reducing carbon emissions over what otherwise would have been. And it's done that while being popular with customers, as well as bringing enormous economic benefits to the state and jobs. However, we are launching this study at a time that many have already identified will be a challenge for these SIP programs going forward. In particular, 2020 is the year that federal lighting standards will fully take effect. And our CE's own Jamie Fitzke has estimated that this standard alone could cut claim savings for electric utilities by roughly 1/3. And then in addition to that, there may be natural gas furnace standards, and there will be other codes and standards coming into effect in that time frame, which will reduce the claim savings. These are all good things for efficiency, but it will reduce the savings that are able to be claimed by utilities. So a big question this study will attempt to address is what will be the total impact of these codes and standards, and what are the opportunities in 2020 and beyond for both saving energy as well as reducing carbon from these programs. And to the extent that there are policy discussions occurring around these issues, this is the chance for this study to help inform those conversations with data. So we have basically 3 overall goals for this study. First, we want to estimate the total savings potential from 2020 to 2029, that's the study time frame, for electric as well as natural gas, and as well as the estimate the carbon reduction potential from this energy savings as well. Secondly, we'd like to provide actionable data resources that could be useful for utilities in targeting their SIP programs, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And finally, we want to provide ample opportunities for stakeholder input, as Jessica mentioned. This is both because we want the study to ultimately be useful and not something that sits on a shelf, but also because we're going to need help from the people on this call and others in collecting some of the data for the study, as well as guidance on key inputs for the study. So we aspire to have this be a collective journey that we are embarking on, and look forward to all of your participation in this journey. This is the project team that will be working on this over the next 15 months or so. And I should note that while we have many of the main folks listed here, there are numerous people that are not listed that will be playing a role in this study, and at Seventh Wave and at Optimal, as well as at CEE. And I know that for CEE, this study is a pretty big deal for us, pretty important, and we're humbled to have this opportunity, and we're going to be working as a whole organization to do the best job that we can for this study. I've listed kind of the specific topic areas that each person or organization will be leading for the study. And as Jessica mentioned, we've got national representation, as well as people who are representing the best and brightest in our own backyard to participate in this. For Optimal Energy is out of Vermont, and they're one of the leading national practitioners of potential studies and have conducted numerous statewide potential studies. Many of you will also be familiar with Seventh Wave. They're out of Madison. They have themselves conducted statewide potential studies, and they've done numerous CARD projects and have a lot of experience in state, in Minnesota. And then finally, ACEEE and eSource, who are both national organizations that most of you are probably familiar with. They'll be involved in consulting on specific aspects of this study and ensuring we're incorporating lessons learned by other states and utilities around the country. So the basic calculation of potential will be in 4 separate categories, starting with the total technical potential, which is the theoretical maximum amount of energy use that could be displaced by energy efficiency. Then we'll apply an economic screen to narrow down the portion of total technical potential that is cost effective. The maximum achievable potential will consider market barriers and the practical reality that no matter how aggressive you market your programs or how attractive the rebates, you're just never going to be able to get 100% of your customers to participate, as many of the utility program managers on this call are already aware. And then finally, the program potential is essentially a sensitivity analysis of that maximum achievable scenario that reflects more average performance of programs or constraints by some utilities in implementing this maximum achievable scenario. In addition to total potential, we're going to have 6 special focus areas that will help to provide actionable and useful information relevant to implementing programs. And I'll go through each of these briefly. First of all, emerging technology. Incorporating new technology in SIP has always been critical to Minnesota's success. If today we were only promoting technologies that were available 5 to 10 years ago, we would only be able to achieve a small portion of the savings that we currently do, that you saw on the slides that Jessica showed earlier. And while no one has a perfect crystal ball, we're going to attempt to look at what are the most promising technologies and categories of technologies that could provide the opportunities for tomorrow in 2020 and beyond. You can see on this slide too some of the current technology-related projects that CEE is working on, most of which are CARD-funded projects. One of the goals of CARD is to make sure that the research is useful to utility programs, and so we hope with this project to synthesize a lot of existing CARD research as well as looking outside CARD to develop useful guidance for utilities. Between Center for Energy and Environment and Seventh Wave, we have received 28 CARD grants. So our team is pretty familiar with these projects as well as the projects that have been done by others. Behavioral programs is another special focus area, and Seventh Wave is leading this task. Behavior programs focus less on replacing equipment and rebates for capital expenditures and more on how to influence people to use that equipment more efficiently, which can include things like training, feedback in energy usage, and energy challenges. The focus here will be on new approaches, such as how to expand behavioral programs into the small business sector, which is an area that Seventh Wave is doing some groundbreaking primary research on right now, and which we hope to leverage for this study. Demand response or load management is another term for this, is about reducing peak demand. So while there is typically some, but not a lot, of energy savings from these demand response programs, since much of the focus is shifting load from one period to another. There are a couple reasons why this will be a key focus area for the study. First of all, these programs are customer-facing, and for customers, there can be little difference between efficiency and demand response programs. From their perspective, they both save money. Efficiency programs and demand response programs can leverage one another. Secondly, as our electricity sources become increasingly reliant on clean but intermittent power sources like wind and solar, demand response will have a larger role to play in helping to integrate these sources onto the grid, and thus in an overall carbon reduction strategy for the state. Since carbon reduction is a major goal of this study, we wanted to make sure that we at least include a qualitative analysis of the potential for demand response in the DSM study. The next one is key market sector analyses. We'll be looking at a few key market sectors to do a deeper dive into specific opportunities within these market sectors for increasing savings within SIP. Low income will be one of these sectors, and we're still working with the DER, and we'll be working with other stakeholders to help determine some additional sectors that would make the most sense to include. And that, for example, it might be agriculture or small business. Energy efficiency programs research. We want to look at best practices for implementing energy efficiency programs and use the latest and greatest methods and practices that are out there. So while we're going to be looking around the country to see what other states are doing, we've also got a lot of great examples of successful approaches within the state. And so we plan to take a deeper dive into our own state successes and see how that could be expanded as well. And finally, policy recommendations. We will be, that will be part of this study, and we'll be working with a lot of the folks who are on the phone to come up with those recommendations that are informed by the data from the study. And Mike Bull, who will be talking in just a second, is going to be heading up that portion of our study. So this is a very data-intensive study, and the calculation of potential is really only as good as the data we use to calculate it. So I think it's worth talking just a second about that. I've listed some of the major categories of data that we'll need, but this is certainly not exhaustive. We are going to be looking to help from the utilities for getting much of this data, and in particular, if there's any utilities on the line that have customer attitudinal or equipment survey data, we'd love to know about it and take a look at it, and that'll help to make our study more robust, the better data that we can get. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about stakeholder input.
Hi everybody, I'm Mike Bull. I'm the Policy Director at the Center for Energy Environment. And as Jessica mentioned, in large part the success of these potential studies will rely heavily on the input, guidance, and data, as Carl just mentioned, that we get from all of you as stakeholders in the process. We've designed a stakeholder engagement process that's intended to ensure engagement is carried out as efficiently as possible between the two studies, enhance outcomes across the studies so they're not siloed. This is a point that Jessica had made early. Inform the technical direction of the studies, ensure transparency and buy-in to the results, identify barriers to higher achieved energy savings and pragmatic solutions to overcome the barriers, and identify and lay the groundwork for cooperatively working on any identified policy solutions. I'll talk about the stakeholder work for the DSM study, and my colleague Travis from GDS Associates will talk about the stakeholder work for the supply side study. We will have, as you can see from this slide, we will employ several different opportunities for stakeholders to provide input to the DSM potential study, both individually and collectively. We'll have a DSM advisory committee that will be a more formal method of informing stakeholders of study progress and soliciting input on key parameters of the study, as well as the development of policy recommendations. We expect the first quarterly meeting of the DSM Advisory Committee to be held by early June. And we're accepting applications now for to be on the advisory committee, and Carl will give you that link here in a minute. We'll plan to interview about 20 of you from each of the various sectors. The key sectors that we're targeting are utilities, implementers, clean energy advocates, consumer representatives, and local governments. And then, so the purpose of the interviews will be to better understand the expectations of various stakeholders for these potential studies and identify and discuss important policy and technical issues. We intend to complete these interviews by the end of June. We'll also have sector meetings. These will be less formal than the advisory committee. This engagement channel will allow members of the 5 specific sectors that I referenced to collectively provide input on specific subjects. And the meetings for these committees will be held as needed and not adhere to any schedule, although we do plan to hold at least one sector meeting for each of the sectors by the fall of 2017. We'll hold technical issue workshops that will be cross-sector meetings to gather input from a wide range of stakeholders with technical expertise on identified topics, and those will be scheduled as needed. Further, we plan to hold 2 public forums to highlight and discuss important potential study topics, bringing in national experts together with local expertise, making these open to the public. I think the first of these will be in the fall of 2017, and the second would be early in 2018. In addition to these channels, we'll also provide periodic email updates, and we'll have 2 interlinking project websites, one for each study. The websites will be a repository of project documents, including minutes from advisory committee meetings, technical memos, project-related presentations, and technical reports related to the study. It'll also list any upcoming meetings and events related to the studies and allow interested folks to sign up for email updates. These project websites will likely go live by the end of the month, if not earlier. And back to Carl.
All right. This is what everyone's been waiting for, I'm sure. The project schedule. So if you are interested in being on that advisory committee, the deadline will be the end of this month, or the 28th, which I think is the last Friday of the month. And then we hope to have the first meeting in June. We're also, Travis is going to be talking in a second about the supply side studies, and we're going to be having a parallel stakeholder engagement process for those supply side studies. And for both of those advisory committees, we'll be showing you a link at the end of this presentation where you can go to sign up for the being considered for the advisory committee. It will be up to the DER to decide who's going to be on that, but you can apply to be on it, as well as to get information about and updates about the DSM study, as well as the supply side study as well. That's at that same link, which is coming up later in the presentation. And then we're going to have I won't go over everything here, but we're looking at next summer for completing the DSM study. And so with that, we'll have time for questions at the end of this presentation, so people should start typing those in the presentation. I think it's the little question mark thing on the screen if they have any questions, and we'll be getting to those in just a second. Oh, here we have.
Here's the link.
Here's the link right here. I forgot about that slide. Mike was whispering to me. And then it appears again at the end of this presentation, so you don't need to worry about writing it down right now. With that, I'll turn it over to Travis.
All right, hi everybody. My name is Travis Hink. I am with GDS Associates, and we have, or I'm going to talk about the other two projects here that focus on the supply side of energy efficiency. So to start off, Jessica and Carl already kind of covered it, but I just want to quickly talk about what supply side efficiency is. Carl was talking about the demand side efforts like LED lighting and HVAC equipment that all occur on the user's side of the utility meter. And so what we're talking about here is supply side, which is typically on the utility side of the meter. Another way of looking at it is that any of these projects, any of these supply side projects that utilities might complete are done without consulting any of their customers. They just the utility does it themselves without involving any of the customers on the end of the meter there. Specifically, it includes things like transmission lines, transformers, anything that is at a substation or in generation facilities. Supply side can also be referred to as infrastructure, or EUI, which stands for electric utility infrastructure. The terms aren't quite exactly interchangeable, but for our purposes, we use them that way pretty often. So if you see EUI or infrastructure, that it means the same thing as supply side. So Jessica mentioned earlier that the Next Generation Energy Act in 2007 sort of restructured SIP programs to become the ones that we know and use today. A provision in that act specifically identifies infrastructure as a potential target for conservation. But even with that explicit provision, there are not that many infrastructure conservation projects that are completed. There are a few big custom ones, but not too many of them. And so we think we have a couple of ideas as to why there aren't many of those, and most of those are technical and policy uncertainty issues. And so that's kind of what the focus of these studies is to look at the uncertainties surrounding infrastructure efficiency and to reduce the barriers to completing infrastructure efficiency projects, and to understand how the entire infrastructure system can be used as an efficiency tool. And then also, as Carl was talking about, that as standards increase and as LED and HVAC efficiency options reach market saturation, we're going to be hitting a point where the quote low-hanging fruit efficiency options may start to dry up, and so utilities will need more tools going forward. And this study here is focused on making sure that infrastructure is one of those tools that utilities can use as an efficiency resource in the future. So here's just a quick slide to illustrate the potential magnitude of the possible opportunity. We know that 12 to 15% of all electricity generated in the country is consumed in the infrastructure used to deliver it. That's a pretty big chunk of consumption, and we know that there's room for improvement. We don't know exactly how much room there is for improvement, which is part of the goal of the project here to find out. But in any case, there's a big, it's a big opportunity. And then just quickly, I said a minute ago that we're pretty sure we know that there are some barriers to using infrastructure as an efficiency resource. And this isn't by any means an exhaustive list, but this is just a couple of the first reasons that we came up with. That part of it was we're pretty sure that lack of standardized saving calculations is a big barrier. When a utility replaces a light bulb right now, there's a defined algorithm that calculates how many kilowatt hours they can claim towards their SIP goals, and until recently that wasn't possible with substation transformers. So that was one major issue that we knew was a problem, and we sort of addressed that a little bit, which I'll talk about in a minute. But then there are also all kinds of other issues that it's unclear what you use as a baseline. If you replace a transformer, do you get to use the old one, or do you get to use code, or what should count as a baseline in most infrastructure projects? If you're not giving out an incentive to a ratepayer, does that reduce the visibility of the program and make it less popular? Are these projects even cost effective? If there's going to be a lot of hassle with it, are there easier options like just putting that money towards a lighting demand side program? And there's potentially a lot more of barriers, which is part of the reason we're conducting the study, to identify and understand these. But basically, the common theme is that there's a lot of uncertainty about policies, about technologies, and about how to use this as an infrastructure, how to use infrastructure as an efficiency tool. And so with that said, we're introducing so the supply side projects are actually two separate projects. So we've got the demand side potential study, then we've got the supply side potential study, and then we have the supply side policy review. And from you guys on the stakeholders end, there will be 3 different reports, but you don't have to remember the difference between these. The point is we're looking for data from you, and if you have any information, we could use it, and it doesn't. We'll handle where to actually apply that information. But the 2 specific projects that we're kicking off are the EUI, or the supply side technical potential study, and then the policy review. And then I just mentioned a second ago that we're building on a prior project that we completed at the end of 2016, and I'll just quickly give an example of what we did there, just so that everybody's on the same page here. You don't have to follow through this. The point is that for those measures like the light bulbs, where the utility already knows how to claim energy efficiency in a standardized prescriptive way, they use the statewide TRM to determine how to do that. And we came up with similar measures for a lot of infrastructure projects that can use the statewide TRM now to calculate savings from things like a substation transformer, or low loss transmission lines, or generation heat rate improvements, or a big one is probably going to be conservation voltage reduction. And so the point of making these measures is that there are a lot of assumptions built into the definition of the variables that are used in these algorithms. And the point is that we've made all those assumptions now and standardized it in the TRM. So when a distribution engineer is considering installing a more efficient transformer, they don't have to worry about what those assumptions are and defend them. They can just use the ones that are already prescribed in the TRM. And so hopefully that reduces a technical barrier that's preventing people from using transformers as an efficiency tool, for example. So we put in place several measures that can be used, and they're in the TRM. It's published now. You can go check those out. And so now we move on to this actual study that we're kicking off today is the EUI Technical Potential Study, their supply side study. It's very similar to the one that Carl laid out for the demand side. The goal is to calculate the total estimated potential to improve EUI efficiency in Minnesota. And the potential, I didn't come up with the graphic the same way Carl did, but if you remember those concentric circles that he had, it's basically the same concept here, where we first determine what the technically possible maximum achievable potential for energy efficiency is in the infrastructure sector, and then we narrow it down by what's economically feasible and then what's realistically achievable. We're going to be using separate models for the generation sector from the transmission and distribution sector, and it's similar to the demand side potential study, but it's a little bit different in that the models aren't already set in stone. We have a pretty good idea of what the models are going to look like, and we're starting to develop our initial data requests that we'll probably be sending to some of you. But the models are going to be flexible, and they may change as we determine what data is available. So that's what makes it a little bit different from the demand side study. So this is the schedule. It's basically we're going to be using the same advisory committee model that Mike outlined, and in fact CEE is on the team for these projects as well, so they're going to be the point of contact for all stakeholders. If you want to join the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, we'll get to that link back up at the end of the presentation here, and the first meeting for that group will be in June. And for this project in particular, one of the things that we're going to be asking the advisory committee is to to verify that the model that we're using makes sense when we're calculating potential. So it'll be a little bit more involved on that level. Other than that, basically the point is that we want to get this project wrapped up by the end of this year. It's partially just because that's how long we think it's going to take, and also because it dovetails with the policy study that we're going to be talking about next. So this is a partial list of major data needs, the things that we're going to be looking for, hopefully from some of you. So we're probably going to need a rough inventory of existing infrastructure specifications, the capacity and numbers of transformers that are deployed, and how AMI deployment is going and what plans are going to be, because that will potentially play a key in how cost-effective it is to implement things like conservation voltage reduction. We'll be looking for load forecasts, and then sort of more qualitatively, we'll be looking for how people at utilities and at regulators interact with policies surrounding infrastructure. And like I said earlier, it's going to be open-ended at first until we nail down the models that we're going to use. So that's the first one. That's the technical potential study. And then the second one is that we're doing a review of policies surrounding infrastructure. And the goal of this project is to understand how regulators and utilities use infrastructure policies, and in terms of how it affects the infrastructure efficiency. So we'll look at how policies are structured and what incentives or disincentives are already in place to improve infrastructure efficiency. And we may recommend potential policy fixes that could drive more investments into efficiency, but more likely it'll probably just be a matter of clarifying the existing policies and making sure that everybody understands how to use infrastructure efficiency as a tool, and make sure that that's a viable tool. So as part of this policy review, we're going to be conducting 4 stakeholder targeted topic meetings. Those are, I've got a next slide coming up with a little bit of an outline of the schedule. Those are going to be a good opportunity for stakeholders to be involved, offer feedback, and see what's going on with this project, and if there's any way that we can help you or you can help us improve this the understanding of infrastructure efficiency. And the final product here is going to be a roadmap for utilities to follow to get to the point where infrastructure is an efficiency tool. Also, as Jessica said earlier, we are getting funding from a Department of Energy grant here, so we figured we should point that out and give them a shout out. And also, as Jessica also said earlier, that Minnesota is kind of leading the country here, so it's a little bit flexible in what our approach is going to be. So the more involved you are as a stakeholder, the more you'll have an opportunity to shape the final product here, and the more likely that it will be useful to you at the end of the day. So here's just a quick summary of the topics of the stakeholder meetings that we'll be holding throughout the project. We will also be inviting expert speakers from around the country to speak either at these meetings or potentially at separate webinars. We don't have the exact speakers lined up yet, but we have a couple ideas and we know what we want them to talk about. And so these are going to be the topics that we discuss as we go through the project. So I figured that since you're all stakeholders, you would probably be interested in stakeholder meetings. And this stakeholder process will be running in parallel with the stakeholder process that Mike laid out earlier. And again, because CE is on all of these projects, they will be coordinating that stakeholder engagement process. So this is the team that we put together for these 2 projects. I guess I could have introduced the team first, but I saved it to the end here. So I'm with GDS Associates, and we're the potential study lead, and we're responsible for the deliverables on the policy study. CEE, who Carl and Mike were speaking earlier, they're doing the stakeholder engagement, and they're coordinating that stakeholder engagement across all 3 projects with the goal of optimizing your effort and your time and making sure that your input is applied where it needs to be and is used optimally across all the projects. We have Cadmus, who brings a lot of potential study expertise and experience, and we're already starting to develop some of the models that we're going to use in the potential study based on Cadmus's model that they've used in the past. And then demand-side analytics is joining the team to help us do some data analysis and some statistical modeling. And then, just because that's the point of this meeting is to get you all involved, just another quick summary of all the ways that you can get involved right now. We'll be looking to collect a lot of data from potentially a lot of you. So if you know that you have something that we might want, it might be easier if you just let us know now before we have to try and figure out who to ask. You can definitely sign up and attend the working group meetings. We don't have a specific schedule yet, but as soon as we do, we'll be sending out invitations to all of you. If you're interested, definitely join that Stakeholder Advisory Committee. That you're going to be able to help shape the final outcomes of the project. If you're a member there, it might take a little bit more effort, but it might be worth it for some of your organizations to be involved. And like I said, we're making every effort to optimize stakeholder input across the 3 projects. And then if you have any ideas, any useful resources, let us know. And if you know of anybody else, any individuals at your organization that might be interested, feel free to pass them a link to this webinar, or just give us their contact information. We can add them to our stakeholder list.
So this is Jessica again. Just wanted to close this out before we start answering some questions. I want to reiterate that as we've worked closely with stakeholders and utilities over the years, we've listened to the challenges and understand the challenges that face utilities as well as the industry. And the purpose of this project is really to try and address some of those challenges. We have no preconceived expectations of what the results are going to be. And ultimately what we want to see is that the data that we use, we analyze, that we model, helps us make data-driven decisions around policy and programs. And so to the extent that our data is good and has integrity, we hope that what the results that we find will lead us to realistic and pragmatic options for utilities and consumers to address some of these challenges. So with that, we're all very excited about this, and we see that we have some questions trickling in. Adam, do you want to read some of those, and then we'll address them as we go?
Sure. Yeah, so it looks like one question that came in is, will there be any planned look back at the previous potential studies to assess at a high level kind of accuracy versus results? I think that's specific to the demand side one.
Well, I guess that would be me then. This is Carl Nelson with CE. That is a great question. We have looked at the past potential studies to make sure that we're consistent in terms of the measures that they were looking at and some of the other assumptions. We're definitely going to be looking at it from that perspective. I think that's a very great idea to sort of back forecast and see how did we do in terms of did we meet the potential that was there, or maybe we didn't predict enough potential compared to what we achieved, because our achievements have been pretty high in recent years. So great suggestion.
Will the best practices identified in the study include regulatory policies, so it can help guide both utilities and regulators? This person thought that it would be very good to ensure that our analysis includes the regulatory context for the identified results.
Yes, I think what we anticipate is that kind of look, that we recognize that it's not just the potential that is going to enable action and describe those best practices and that they'll just go forth and be implemented. We also recognize that there is a regulatory interface with this, and that as you know, we've identified over time that we have some constraints, whether they are existing policy or statutes, that may need to be addressed to help utilities and consumers be able to realize the results of the studies. So that is definitely on our radar, and we hope to use that aspect.
And we specifically, this is Carl again, we specifically put people on our team that have that kind of expertise. Marty Kusler from ACEEE is on this call and available to answer any questions, although I don't think we need to get into any more detail on that. But he's very knowledgeable about policies in other states. And Optimal Energy as well has a lot of experience in working with policy issues in other states. In fact, they manage the Massachusetts technical process that they have there for making policy-related decisions. So very close to those what's going on in other states at a pretty deep level.
Great, thanks. It looks like we have a lot of great questions coming in, and just a reminder for people to type them in as they come into your mind. We won't be able to address all of the questions as part of the webinar, but we certainly can follow up with people afterwards to try to answer your questions that you may have about the project. So I think I'll move on to a couple EUI related questions. One of them is, are there any other states that have a similar provision in statutes or allow utilities to claim EE savings for supply-side investments?
I don't know for sure if there are any that specifically call for it in the statute. I do know that there are states that have developed some semblance of what we're working on. There are places that have talked about codifying conservation voltage reduction. It's not a measure, but more of a protocol. And there are some states that have been working on incentives sort of in a piecemeal way. As far as I know, there is no state that broadly targets infrastructure as an efficiency tool. So we're kind of breaking ground here.
Great. So another person mentioned that energy efficiency cleared the latest MISO capacity auction, 98 megawatts, for the first time. And this person's wondering how we're planning to coordinate with MISO through this project.
So this is Jessica. I'll take that one. We at the department have had some coordination with staff at MISO as they are enabling some of these activities, and as they are embarking on their most recent transmission planning process. They are very interested in what states are doing, particularly around efficiency and distributed generation, because it impacts their overarching plans to serve their purpose. Some of the conversations that we've had, they do have a specific interest in understanding how we are looking at efficiency across the entire value chain of the system. So we don't know that we'll be able to have someone from MISO on our technical advisory committees. However, we do expect that there will be engagement and some coordination to make sure that we have continuity and understanding, given that we are part of the MISO footprint.
Great. Well, it looks like we're pretty close to time here, so thinking it'll be good to wrap up the presentation. And again, feel free to reach out to us with any questions about either of the projects, and can address your questions. You can email them directly to me at adam.zoet@state.mn.us. And also, please sign up to get updates about the studies using the link on the screen, and apply for our advisory committees. So with that, thanks for joining us, and we'll keep in touch.